Let's see, I think I'm all set up here. All right. Move everyone around. So yeah, thank you so much, Angel, for that introduction. It was really interesting to hear about what you guys have been up to, and thanks everyone for attending this presentation tonight. This was just really kismet because when Angel reached out to me to have this presentation, I had just picked up my first mushroom block from the recycle program that same day. So I was like, oh my God, what a coincidence. Yes, I would love to be involved with the organization. You guys are doing such interesting work. But I should just say up front that I'm not a mycologist. I'm just really getting started with my education in this area, and I'm learning all the benefits of fungi and the fascinating networks of information that mycelium creates. So, but I do see a lot of similarities between these two interests, between natural burial and mycology, particularly in the way that they both embrace decay and decomposition as a really vital process to sustaining our environment. So I love that we can just talk about that openly. And that's why I put in the title of the program that this is a fungi-friendly burial option, because it really does support that part of the life cycle, and it really attempts to remove barriers that more conventional burial options are going to put in the way of that decomposition process. Just to give a quick overview of what I want to talk about tonight, I will start with a little introduction of myself and the topics of conservation or of the burial, principles of conservation cemeteries. I'll touch on mycology and burial a little bit through some of the mushroom burial products that have become available. I'll do a little introduction to Campo de Estrellas, which is my project, and then talk a little about how you can plan for this type of burial. And hopefully that still leaves us some time to have a little Q&A at the end for discussion. This presentation isn't an exhaustive discussion on the topic. There's a lot we could get into, so just wanted to kind of give you the high points. And you can always reach out to me afterwards if you have more things that you want to discuss, please. Before I jump into the principles of this type of burial, I did feel like it was important to kind of establish some of what I see were the similarities between natural burial and mycology, specifically with regard to both of them connecting us back to some really ancient practices. For my part, with alternative death care, what is known as alternative death care today is like things like natural burial, things like death doulas, things like home funerals. That's really gained a lot of significance over the last decade, partly due to the influence of social media. As a funeral professional, I've been involved in some collectives and communities that have focused on these practices, but I've seen them go from like really fringe concepts to just regularly appearing on my news feed, on my social media feed. Even platforms like LinkedIn, I'm seeing colleagues now pursuing these activities professionally, which is really interesting. But it's kind of important to know that these are not actually new funeral practices. What we're referring to as alternative today are, really some of our oldest traditions. Historically, every society has had, a community-oriented way of dealing with their dead, and their burial practices were inevitably natural before we had this rise of chemical embalming and vaults and cemeteries. People all over the world were burying in the earth without excessive materials. Native cultures would use the mound burial as a way to mark the grave, and to this day, it's the Jewish and Muslim tradition to still be buried without chemicals or metal materials in caskets. So while we've always had this type of burial available, as we became a more industrialized society, our death practices really followed suit. And the modern funeral industry really rose to popularity by playing on this fear of disease and of decomposition and decay after death, which allowed them to create and ultimately profit from some of the toxic practices that we have today. And that really started to change with the publication of Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death in 1963. You might have heard of that book. And that really revealed the futility of a lot of those practices. And the scrutiny started to continue to grow with the rise of environmentalism, and climate change activism, and that really encouraged people to look at their impact on the earth. So just for perspective, in a 10-acre cemetery, like a city cemetery, there's about 1,000 tons of casket steel and about 20,000 tons of concrete from the burial vaults, and enough wood in the coffins to build about 40 homes. That's all just contaminating the soil. And then on the more economical end, with cremation, that one cremation uses about 28 gallons of fuel, to say nothing of the toxins that are released into the atmosphere during that process. So that knowledge is really leading people towards these alternative death practices with a renewed interest in their environmental benefits. And the internet has really made sharing knowledge on these topics much easier and much faster than ever. And so I think it's really exciting to see a resurgence in these really ancient traditions that reflect our desire, I think, as a species to just be a part of this aspect of our lives. And from my perspective, I think mycology has been on a similar trajectory, where industrialized farming has really created toxic sites of barren land, and pharmaceutical companies have come in and really capitalized on gatekeeping life-saving drugs. I think modern mycology, from what I understand, has really arisen to meet those challenges. And we see mushrooms now being, widely discussed and studied for their environmental and their medical and their even spiritual benefits. And I think that trend really parallels this growing interest in natural burial, because both of those concepts connect us to this life cycle of nature. They expose us to decay and decomposition, and really just to create new life. And that they also highlight the ecological benefits, like reducing resource use and minimizing harmful materials in the soil. One fascinating example that kind of brings together both of these topics that I found in my research is the story of Otzi the Iceman, if anyone's familiar. He's a 5,300-year-old cadaver that they found frozen in the Italian Alps. He was thought to have been murdered. He had an arrowhead in his back, but he was preserved in the ice, and they found also artifacts preserved with him, and he was carrying necklaces of mushrooms. He had birch polypore with him, and he had false tinder fungus. And they found in examining his cadaver that he had a lot of parasites. So the thought is that he was using the birch polypore for medicine and the false tinder fungus for starting fires, for survival. And to me, that story just really underscores how mycology has really been integral to human history, and how studying ancient remains can really teach us a lot about human decay and physiology. So just to give a brief bio about myself now, since you're probably wondering who I am and why I'm speaking to you. I started working, my name's Sarah Wambold, and I started working in conventional funeral industry almost 2 decades ago now at this point. And I became a licensed funeral director in 2005. I grew up in a really rural community in the Midwest where it was very small, and if somebody passed away, we probably knew who that person was, and so we would attend the funeral, and death was just something that was really openly discussed and a part of all of our lives growing up. And as I got older, I started to work in nursing homes where I helped people towards the end of their life and helped them transition, and got to know a lot of funeral directors that way as well. And so I just had this natural gravitation towards the industry and decided that was, what I wanted to do. And I got into the industry and I was really learning a lot, but I started to realize that the industry was starting to prioritize their own needs over what I was seeing with what grieving families actually wanted. Many families were asking to spend more time with the body, and did they need to have embalming, or why should we embalm somebody? And then they would ask about natural burial, and they didn't really have a good understanding of it. They were wondering could they just be buried in their backyard? Could they be buried under a tree? And back then, there just weren't great answers to those questions, and the industry certainly wasn't interested in answering or addressing those needs. And I started to feel really stuck. So I left the industry to really find out some of these answers on my own. And I didn't want to come back into this work until I could address some of these questions that families had asked. And I became involved with a group here in Austin that focused on home funerals mostly, but also green burials. And that's where I really learned about the legal aspects of this type of burial. And I met a woman who owned a green burial cemetery just east of Austin. And she invited me out to her cemetery to visit one time, and I really didn't know what to expect. I had no idea of a place that didn't have, you know, these headstones or vaults. Like, what was I going to see? But when I arrived, it was just this extremely serene environment, these really tall, beautiful oak trees, this nice winding paths, and in between the trees were these really minimal, simple, peaceful graves. And I was so struck by that. It just suddenly made so much sense. And I knew that was what I wanted to do and what I wanted to focus on. So I was lucky enough to work with her for the next 2 years. And that's where I just learned everything I know today about this form of burial, and was able to help families facilitate burials and services and dig graves and maintain graves. And eventually it drove me to want to start a cemetery of my own, which is Campo de Estrellas. So just to kind of go over the concepts of natural burial, there's a few different types, but natural and green burial, they're the same. I'm going to use them interchangeably. I think we're all familiar with green as kind of the marketing term for, you know, environmentalism, but natural and green burial is the same thing. And this type of burial really aims to minimize the environmental impact and conserve natural resources. The Green Burial Council, which is an organization that was founded in 2005 and helps to create green burial spaces, defines this burial as a way of caring for the dead with minimal environmental impact that aids in the conservation of natural resources, reduction of carbon emissions, protection of worker health, and the restoration and preservation of habitat. So this includes using non-toxic and biodegradable materials for caskets, shrouds, and urns. And once you have a natural burial, it can take place in a few different types of cemeteries. There's a hybrid, what's known as a hybrid cemetery, which you might see more in an urban area or a city, and that's where you would have conventional burial taking place, like with the headstones and the vaults, and embalming is allowed. But then there might be a section to the side or wherever that only allows for natural burial, where you don't have to be embalmed and you can be buried in just a casket without a vault. Then you also can see natural burial cemeteries, and those are usually established outside of a city. It's really hard to establish a cemetery inside of a city. So all natural burial cemeteries don't allow for any embalming, no vaults, only biodegradable containers are allowed in the grave sites, and no upright headstones typically. And then the next type of cemetery is what's known as a conservation cemetery, and that is only containing natural burial plots as well. However, the land would also include things like wildlife protections or exemptions or easements, and environmental surveys done that have as a goal to rewild and to conserve the flora and the fauna of the land. And that's the type of cemetery that my project is working to establish. Oh, missed a slide. Regardless of where the natural burial takes place, all natural burial adheres to some very specific principles. No embalming, no cement vaults, minimal grave decoration, and biodegradable burial containers. So we can take a look at what each of these are and how they differ from the conventional burials today. So we'll start with embalming. I think everyone's maybe familiar with this as kind of the most toxic procedure in funerals today. Historically, embalming is actually, modern embalming, I should say, is a military technology. It was originally developed and used on Union soldiers who died on the battlefield of the Civil War to be able to travel home without decaying in the process. We didn't have very good refrigeration back then, so families who wanted to see their soldier one more time weren't able to, and so they developed this arterial embalming system. However, today, embalming has really become a way to turn a body into a product that's sold by funeral homes. There's a book called Grave Matters by Mark Harris. That's a very early book on this subject that does a really good job of breaking all of this down. And today they have created formaldehyde-free formulas. However, the the procedure itself is largely unnecessary, and it still directly harms both the workers and the environment. It's not a completely toxic-free procedure. So despite funeral directors' insistence on the usefulness of this procedure for like sanitizing the body for public display, embalming is actually not required by law in any state or any public safety standard, frankly. Dead bodies don't easily transmit diseases. The World Health Organization states that the risk of disease from a dead body is real only in the case of a highly infectious disease, because most microorganisms that cause death don't survive after the host has died, and they're not readily transmissible. So just using appropriate protective clothing like a mask and gloves and using good hygiene, that is sufficient in preventing the spread of disease. And we do have really robust refrigeration available now, so that really helps stave off decomposition and decay, and any harmful microbial matter can be really staved off without the need for embalming. If you think about it, nature has been breaking down and absorbing dead material for, millennia without harming the environment or others. And so we don't really need to drain all the fluid from a body and replace it with harmful chemicals at this point. And those chemicals especially are posing a greater risk to us and the environment. They damage plant life, they damage the soil, they contaminate the water supply. So eliminating that is really crucial in protecting our environment. Concrete vaults or cement vaults, also known as the grave liner, are not allowed in a natural burial cemetery. These are materials that are just placed in the graves that just encase the casket, and they're sealed before the dirt is replaced onto the grave. They're really marketed as a way to protect the casket and the body from the elements, but their actual true function is to maintain cemetery grounds. It makes it easier for lawn care. The production of concrete also is extremely resource intensive. And once all of that is in the ground, they're impermeable, so they encourage water runoff and they cause flooding, and they would just allow toxins like any pesticides used in the lawn of the cemetery to seep back into the soil and further degrade it. They also add an increased expense to the funeral. They can cost anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, perhaps even more. One thing about vaults also is that they require a grave depth to be deeper than what's necessary. The assumed 6 feet underground concept is actually not required by law either. It's really just to accommodate the vaults. The law only requires that the grave be a depth of 3 feet, which is what natural burial allows for. And that's really good for us because a shallow grave is where the real work of a natural burial lies. I mean, that's where the most active particles in the soil are. That's where the oxygen, the insects, and the microbes are. And that really allows for the body to decompose more quickly and to nurture the soil around it. And I think, in my opinion, the real damage caused by vaults actually lies in this misunderstanding of death. They create this false sense of separation from the natural process of decomposition after burial by pretending, to keep out the dirt, to keep out the rain. But I've witnessed disinterments at cemeteries, and I can tell you that that's not true. The seals eventually break as well. And they also perpetuate this notion that nature's our enemy and that uneven ground and overgrown grass is ugly, when in fact it's really just, it's natural and it's restorative. Minimal grave decoration is also another principle of natural burial. If you think about the headstone, also known as the permanent marker, that's really the most iconic part of a cemetery. And I think the absence of a headstone or a grave marker is really deeply coded in our society today as disrespectful and tragic, and for good reason. I think many people in our society have not had agency in death to mark the grave of their loved ones as they would wish, among many other indignities. So I'm really sensitive to the fact that not marking a grave or not putting up a headstone can feel disrespectful. And I acknowledge that that's a really important symbol of permanence. So it's important to remember, though, that natural burial cemeteries do allow for headstones. They have a different criteria, which is to be as unimposing on nature as possible. Options would be having a flat stone that comes from the geological region where you're being buried. So something around here would be like fieldstone or limestone, wood also. Anything that just isn't using the aluminum or I think it's like tin oxide powder that makes a shiny finish on the stone could be used to mark the grave. They can also be marked with, plants and flowers can be planted on the grave. Biodegradable, recycled paper items are also allowed. Things like artificial flowers or plastic wreaths are not typically allowed, but I have seen where you can put them there for a short period of time, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, as long as they're removed after a very specific amount of time. But one unique aspect of natural burial sites is that they do use GPS coordinates as permanent markers, and typically those are stamped onto plot caps that are placed at the corners of each plot, and each grave would have them. Each garden has its own, and they're recorded so that future generations know where to determine the location. And that method, it does ask families to consider a new way of marking a grave with, in addition to establishing a traditional marker. So it does also help, I think, establish a new relationship with the land where our person is buried at. As the stone fades, as the wood deteriorates, we're just really asked to brighten our memory of the person. And also it just kind of helps infuse the spirit of the land as well. And that's actually very important, I think, in the restoration of the land as a whole, that kind of gets overlooked. Biodegradable burial containers are used as well. So anything like a wooden casket or a shroud. I've seen even cardboard boxes that are being marketed that are available for families to like decorate before they go into the ground. Less popular, but still an option, is to be buried without any container at all. I have seen that done as well, but there's a lot available in this area right now. And that's also where we see, excuse me, some crossover with the mycology community recently. There have been some products that have been developed that put to use microremediation. And I think the most probably known product is the infinity burial suit, or the mushroom burial suit, which was designed by the artist J. Rim Lee. And this is a suit that's infused with mushroom spores to perform microremediation on the body. So you can see the veins of the suit there is where the spores would be placed. And that suit uses mycorrhizal and sapophoric fungi to detoxify the body and then enrich the surrounding soil. And it really came into popularity in 2019 when the actor Luke Perry died, and he was actually buried in one of these suits on his own property. And I did actually have the opportunity to meet Jay when she lived in Austin for a little while back in 2014. That's a picture of her and my old boss there. And I know of at least one burial suit that was buried of hers here in Austin. So since then, there have been some other products, some other mushroom-based products that have come to market. Most recently, there's a company called Loop Biotech that is based in Delft, the Netherlands, and they're developing a living coffin from mushroom spores, and then also an urn. And I couldn't get a great deal of information about it. It just said mushrooms, local mushroom species, and hemp fibers. So hopefully one day they'll publish more information about particular spores that they're using. And that's just one example that I've seen, and what I'm sure will be more products that are utilizing mushrooms for burial containers as the science and the interest around microremediation grows. And I think what I find honestly most promising about these products is the conversation that they initiate when someone chooses them. They really bring people into a discussion about sustainability and becoming a part of nature at the end of life. And creating a place for people to return to nature is necessary in this case. And that's what my project is intending to do. So my project is called Campo de Estrellas, and it's a 9.5 acre swath of former cattle pasture in East Texas. It's just south of Smithville in a small farming community called Covar, Texas. It's part of what's called Abbey Grange. It's a 30-acre farm that's owned by my partners in the project, Cindy and her son, Michael Ibarra. Cindy and Michael are both environmentalists in their own right, and Cindy was especially leading an effort to restore and preserve the acreage using a mix of reforestation and rewilding techniques. And I got connected to them through a mutual friend after Cindy expressed interest in wanting to be buried on her own property. And so when I introduced them to the concept of creating a conservation cemetery, like knowing all of their environmental efforts, they were immediately on board. And so together we just set out to establish a cemetery that focused on the restoration and conservation of the property. So just a note on the name, Campo de Estrellas, that comes from Cindy and Michael's experience walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain, which is a centuries-old pilgrim's route of several hundred miles. It starts at the top of Spain, and it takes you to the city of Santiago de Compostela, where it's believed that St. James is buried. And in Latin, Compostela is a combination of the words campos and stelle, and that means field of stars. And that's also a reference to this legend that a bright star led the hermit Pelagius to the site of the burial. And Campo de Estrellas in Spanish also means field of stars. So it's a nod for us to the gorgeous night sky above the cemetery at night, because there's no surrounding light pollution and the constellations are just very clearly visible. So it just felt right. We established Campo de Estrellas with a couple initiatives in mind. The first being the environment, of course, protecting and rewilding the land while also providing a meaningful space for others to connect with nature. Also for education, we have been conducting webinars. We've done some workshops in person at the cemetery to really familiarize people with natural burial, because I know not many people know what this is, or they don't get to experience it very often. So our workshops really give a history of the land itself. They go into depth on the legal aspects of this type of burial and starting a cemetery. And then we invite participants to join us in a hands-on demonstration of shrouding a body and then processing to a grave, just to give people that extra step in going through the process before they have to, because again, it is a really different type of burial. And that's been really meaningful and a really great experience. And then we just wanted to be an alternative, affordable option for families who were maybe wanting to be buried, but we're balking at the cost, because it can be very expensive with all of the additional costs involved in that. We are not as inexpensive as cremation, but we're squarely in between, and we're still quite affordable. And since then, we've progressed through several phases. We've had our land surveyed and established as a cemetery with Bastrop County, and we've hosted our workshops. And so we've begun to develop the infrastructure on the land by cutting roads and mowing paths. And we've put up a pavilion for ceremonies and put in signage, as well as like a temporary gate for access for burials. And so we're now open for the sale of plots for any pre-need or at-need services, with this goal of really generating capital to continue improving on the infrastructure. And also we're actively seeking partnerships with environmental organizations to secure this intention of becoming a full conservation cemetery. And just to talk about, the land restoration projects that we have going on at the cemetery, the tract was a clear-cut, overgrazed, neglected piece of pasture, essentially, where we had cattle. There had been cattle on them, and so we moved the cattle off, and the mesquite had really moved in, which made it unsuitable for planting any type of crop. But we actually really appreciate the mesquite for its ability to really hold the soil in place, because there was a lot of soil degradation, and it replenishes it as well. So it's also an iconic tree of Texas, and we've just really worked with it. It makes a really beautiful, sort of landscape. It's very peaceful. And we find we follow what we call a benign neglect approach to allow nature to just start to thrive again. And we've created habitats for wildlife and restoring the ecosystem by leaving any dead trees or snags, as they're called, and brush piles from anything that we've cleared out to make space for gardens or for paths, and keeping them in place for animals to begin to nest again, and for the moss and lichen and fungi to really just flourish and continue to replenish the soil as well. As for the rewilding part of it, we do this by restoring and protecting these wild areas to allow for apex predators to thrive. So that would include, predatory birds and coyotes and even wild hogs to come through, and then just allow them to interact with native species that they would normally interact with. The ultimate goal is to mitigate the species extinction and restore balance. We don't want to go too heavy one way or introduce one specific thing and go heavy the other way. We really want to restore that balance and function to create a more diverse and sustainable ecosystem than the monoculture that was starting to appear. And last year, we also began our reforestation efforts on the cemetery. We partnered with tree folks and planted over 7,500 trees across the whole property, but a majority of those were on the cemetery itself. So if you've gotten this far and you're still interested in perhaps pursuing this type of burial, I will just go over planning for this type of burial. It can be, it's very different, and it can be confusing and somewhat challenging if you're not prepared. So just knowing what's needed prior to death really helps alleviate stress. There's just a lot of emotions that happen regardless of if you're prepared or not. So it's always good to just kind of know what you're working with. So the first thing to do would be schedule a visit. If you, wanted to visit us or a place of your choosing, you would just contact them and visit to pick a spot or just get a feel for the land. And that can be done, at need, or it can be done much farther in advance. And I think, we might be the first call that you ever make to prepare for something like this, but we'll also be the last part in the burial preparation. So if we're to move forward and say that a death has occurred, the next plans that you would have to put in place, we get a lot of questions about. And because we're not a funeral home, we're just a cemetery. These are things that you would need to plan for outside of buying a plot. We don't provide services for transportation of the body to the cemetery, refrigeration, or preparation of the body. But those can all be handled by using a funeral home. They can be handled without the use of a funeral home. That's kind of what's known as a home funeral. But it can be really challenging to do all of that if you're, not well resourced or not prepared. So it's important to just know that you can call on a funeral home if you're going to do this type of burial. It feels antithetical, but it's not. A lot of the funeral homes that we work with in the surrounding communities are very familiar with this and very happy to help facilitate this type of a burial. So you would want to make arrangements for the transportation and the refrigeration and preparation of the deceased. And then the next step is pretty crucial. It's the filing of a death certificate. And this is probably where you would have to contact a funeral home. In the state of Texas, I know a licensed funeral director has to file this, and they have to be connected to a funeral home in order to do it. So I'm not connected to a funeral home, so I wouldn't be able to file a death certificate on anyone's behalf. But that's something that a funeral director could certainly help you with. And that needs to be done prior to a burial taking place. And then just staying in communication. So, once a death has occurred, you would notify us at the cemetery and let us know and give us instructions on when you would like the burial to take place. And we would contact our cemetery service to prepare the gravesite before the day of burial. And then, remain in contact with you from that point on to coordinate any arrival times or any graveside needs. And that can include, if you wanted to lower the casket in yourself, if you wanted to help with the digging or putting soil back onto the grave, that's all part of, options that are available. I will say with hand digging graves, we certainly allow it, but if anyone has tried to dig a hole in Central Texas, that can take quite a bit of time and energy. So if you're up for it, go ahead. But we also have a service that we can certainly call on as well. And I'll just close out with some additional resources for everyone. If you're not joining us from Texas, the Funeral Consumer Alliance at funerals.org is a really great nationwide resource that provides state level information on funeral laws and green burials and planning resources. So they're great to look into. If you are in the Austin area or in Central Texas, Funeral Consumer Alliance of Central Texas is a wonderful resource. They have just a ton of information, and they do workshops and things about just anything to do with end of life, from creating a will or advance directives to planning a green burial. And crucially, they have a price list that compares all regional funeral homes and cemeteries in the area, so you can kind of get an idea up front of what you're working with. And as I mentioned before, the Green Burial Council, also a great organization that provides nationwide resources for information about natural burials and has a list of certified green burial cemeteries around the country. And so that's it for me. I'll leave my contact information up here in case anybody wants to reach out later about anything that I've talked about. I hope I didn't go on too long. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk. Thanks so much for letting me share tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really great overview. Appreciate it so much. Yeah, so there's a few comments in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, just kind of pop I think there's like a hand raise reaction, or I think you can raise your hand or feel free to just come unmute.
I can't really see everyone. So if someone has a hand raised, I can't.
Yeah.
I can't see everyone.
Not seeing any.
Okay.
One of the questions that I have, you know, I know, there were some things in our legislature, I know there's a lot of parts of Texas that don't allow, or I've been told, like Travis County, for example, they don't allow natural burials, or there's no natural burial preserves or anything like that. And there were some things like in the legislature, this last legislature, to try to change some of that. Do you know kind of like what the landscape in Texas looks like? I know
Yeah,
it's like a big question. I'm sure
no,
there's a
it's
lot.
okay. I wonder if you're conflating a couple of things, because I know in Travis County, natural burials is available in all counties in Texas. It's a matter of where the burial takes place. In the city, it would have to be in, like I said, one of those hybrid cemeteries. So in a established cemetery, they might set aside like a section for just natural burial. And the cemetery that I was working at is in Travis County, but it's at least 5 miles outside the city limits. So depending on the size of the city that you want to serve, you need to be there's a different mileage that you need to be outside of the city, and that's because we're a big metropolitan area, 5 miles out is where you would need to start your new all natural burial cemetery. But what you might be referring to with regard to legislation is the human composting, which is a new form of disposition, and a really exciting one that reduces a body very quickly into soil, and it's called Recompose, I believe, is the company that's heading it up. Katrina Spade founded that company. And that is not yet legal in Texas. I think it's legal now in 10 states, I've heard, maybe 11. And yeah, there was movement last legislation. There was a bill put forward to move that through and to make that legal, along with aquamation or water cremation, which also reduces the body to an effluent using water, which is less energy intensive than flame cremation. And I think that was also wrapped up into the bill. Unfortunately, if anyone has done legislative work, I have, things don't really move very quickly through the ledge or at all. And they take a lot of, work and pounding of the pavement to get across the desks of our legislators who seem concerned with, frankly, a lot of other unserious things. So, we can try again in 2 years, but yeah, we're kind of at a standstill until we can get these bills pushed forward to have at least those two options available, which would be great. I mean, we could certainly use that, if somebody was able to be reduced to a soil mixture with recompose, we could certainly put it out into the cemetery. That would be totally fine. And I see that movement, and I think it's really exciting stuff. So hopefully we can, maybe get a group together in 2 years and really stay on top of our lawmakers.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely would love to kind of be involved in any way to get our, especially with like testimony,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Um, yeah, so Lori, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, I didn't have a question. I'm Lori, but maybe there's another Lori.
I think it's
I'm
Lori
No,
Bell.
here I am. My phone didn't show the unmute. I was just wondering if there could be a video of all of this available afterwards, just exactly what was said here today.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat below. But yeah,
Super.
we put all of our recordings on our YouTube channel.
Oh, super. Thank you. I'm in another
All
state.
right. Yeah, so Ramona asks, what is the cost range of a conservation burial?
Yeah, so the plots in our cemetery, single plots start at $1,800. And that actually doesn't include the opening and closing of a grave. So if you were to use the cemetery service, that's a price calculated by the service themselves. And right now they charge, I think, $1,075 for the open and the close. So you're still, saving quite a bit. I think burials in the city of Austin start around $3,000. And we also sell double plots, and those start at $2,600. But like I said, you can hand dig a grave. That would save you the cost of that opening and closing, but it would give yourself like a couple days to do that and don't do it in June or July. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Angel.
Sorry about that, y'all. So Ulrich shared a comment that the owners of Haggard Ranch in Bexar County, they offer natural burial plots, and that's San Antonio area. I don't know all my Texas counties really well, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Marianne asks if mycelium caskets were available in Texas, would there be a market for them? It sounds like you really only need a shroud. Yeah, and I guess that's just a matter of opinion. I think, you know,
I think they really speak, caskets and outer burial containers, they speak to different people for different reasons. Shrouds can feel not enough for some people. Some people really like to be, enclosed into a more sturdy structure. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of opinion, but it seems like there is. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of people have interest in at least using mushroom in some form, at the end of life. So I don't know, I guess we could ask the audience what they think.
yeah, feel free to add your thoughts in the comments. Before I know some people are starting to jump off. I want to do that giveaway. We have like a mushroom journal, Texas Mushroom Journal, that helps you kind of document your observations out in the forest. There's some super mush, my mushroom mouth spray, and a mushroom tea. And so tonight we just did kind of a random number, picked a random number, and went down the list. And Miss Angie is whose name I picked. And so if you want to Miss Angie, I'll go ahead and message you the email. I just need to get your mailing address and I'll send that over to you. Um, but yeah. What is everybody else's thoughts on the mycelium coffin or the mycelium chamber? I know there was with the burial suit, that was like there was a lot of people sharing that.
Yeah.
I'd never even heard of that. Thank you. Thank you for presenting. This was really educational and interesting.
Yeah, no problem. I personally find the mycelium, like the microremediation in burial products, to be really fascinating and really like ripe for study and investigation. I would love to see. I haven't been able to find kind of the results of any of these products and what the soil was before, what the soil was after. I don't know if anything's been published, but I would love to see that information. So, yeah, if you're thinking of doing that, or this group, I think, knows quite a bit. You do so much with with the meme lab in San Antonio. Like I would love to know how we can incorporate that more into our space as well.
I was thinking of reishi because it's very sturdy, but then I was like, maybe it's too sturdy. I don't know. Once it dries out, it's pretty heavy duty. So I don't know. It'd just be interesting to know some details about that. And
I think I did hear that oyster was used in the suit. I think reishi might have been, and turkey tail maybe. They were all edible mushrooms, if I recall. But yeah.
It just seems like, could you get too much of it in your cemetery? Like if everybody did it, is there such thing as too much? I don't know. So anyway, it would be interesting just to hear the science behind it.
Yeah, definitely. Would love to know that as well. Ulrich, you have your hand raised. Do you want to unmute?
Yes, sure. Thank you for all this information. I'm personally, since I lost the grave sites from my grandparents, they're overseas, and over there you pay for a certain time period. If you don't renew, you lose the plot. So I'm really a little bit disenchanted about burial here, and I was even down to the point that donation of my body would have been not such a bad idea, but I really do like I was always like scared of the the whole thing of being displayed. This to me sounds much more natural and in tune how I feel. So I thought this was very interesting. Thank you for this talk.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I've heard that, in Europe and other countries, they do have like a lease on graves. And I think that's really interesting. It speaks to kind of like this American idea that we just like one body, one grave, and we're there forever, and it's very individualized, and we're just kind of encased in these boxes instead of becoming one again with nature, or just being in community with other people, or sharing at all in any way. I mean, in other places it's very natural and common, but we just have really sectioned ourselves off in this country, and I'm trying to kind of change minds on that a little bit. But yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, Daryl has his hand raised. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sarah. I've really loved your presentation. It's really been fascinating, and it's definitely changed the way I'm viewing the way I'm going to end my life, hopefully in one of your plots. But I was just wondering, in terms of the conservation burial, it seems it's a little fringe at the moment, and I was just wondering, everyone, it kind of goes to the church, and the whole process is going through the church. If someone was, say, a Methodist or Catholic, and they requested to have a conservation burial, how would that go?
You mean in terms of what the church allows?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I'm not a theologian by any means, but from what I understand, committing a body to the earth is more accepted in the church than cremation has been. I think, and especially with regard to the laws that I was just talking about with the aquamation and the recompose, I know one big blocker with those getting through was the Catholic Church, had a lot to say about the legality of that and kind of putting a stop to that. So I don't know for a fact, but I have a feeling that being just committed to the earth is okay, but I would have to ask a Methodist, minister the specifics. But, we just work with the families that would like this, and I'm assuming that they would have had worked that out, hopefully prior to coming. But we're, we service all religions also, so.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Okay, Matt, he wrote a comment and a question. So assuming that the plots are reused, how long does it take until it can be reused?
Well, that's a good question. We haven't made the decision to reuse plots at our cemetery. It's not something that's actually really practiced in the United States. I think it is more in I think in Europe. And I think New Orleans also has that practice of sweeping out the tombs after a certain point. And here's the thing: decomposition, or a burial in Texas, it really is hard to determine how long that's going to take, just based on the type of the person and how they lived their lives and what was in their body at the time of death, and then the soil conditions and the weather conditions and all of these things. So it's really hard to say when we would be able to reuse a grave at a certain point. And so we haven't decided to do that at this point. I hope that kind of answers your question. But I'm not sure how long in New Orleans or I think it's maybe like 20 or 30 years is what I've heard, but I'm not entirely sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have a question about I saw that in a couple of other states it's legal, and there's processes where you can have your body composted and turned into soil,
Mm-hmm.
and then given to, rather than ashes, you're giving soil to your loved ones to use in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about the process. That's as little as I know.
Yeah.
And I know I don't think it's legal here in Texas because it's a kind of an industrial process, right?
It is. And I am not an expert either. Shoot, what did I just read? There is some, a mulch mix that's used to, rapidly accelerate the process. And I'm not clear on what all the materials are in that mix. I'm sure that that's out there. The company Recompose has been very good with their information. But yeah, that's not legal yet in Texas. But yeah, it probably does still involve some use of energy. Just all of those things are going to require energy being used to reduce the body in that quick amount of time. It's, I think, less than burning, fuel though for a cremation retort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions, but I'd love to, maybe in the fall or during the winter, schedule a workshop with you all as well.
Yeah.
Can you kind of share a little bit about kind of what your workshops entail, and maybe what is involved, and kind of we can kind of look forward to that when things cool down again?
Yeah, exactly. We invite everyone out to the cemetery, and there's the farmhouse that's just adjacent to the cemetery where we would gather. And then Cindy, Michael, and I give presentations on different aspects of the cemetery. Cindy really goes over the history of the land and the farm itself, and a more in-depth understanding of the ecological composition of the area. And then Michael is a lawyer, and he goes into detail about just the laws surrounding burial itself, around what we were kind of dealing with when we established a cemetery. It's not really well known, but kind of one of the benefits of living in Texas is that it's pretty easy to establish like a family cemetery if you own property outside of the city. So we give information on how to potentially do that if you're interested, and how we did it ourselves. And then I go over kind of what I just talked about today, sort of what you would want to do to plan for this type of burial, what it all entails, what the principles are. And then we take a little break, have a little bit to eat, and then have our little mock ceremony, which Sydney has made the shroud that was in the picture there. And we practice wrapping someone in a shroud just to give someone hands-on experience with doing that, and then process on foot over to a nearby grave. We don't dig the hole. We don't put anyone inside. We just kind of lay them on top in sort of in a mock fashion. But that, I think, goes a long way into giving people like a hands-on experience with just being out in the cemetery and what it might feel like to go through this, because I don't know that it happens very often. And when it's the first time, what I also wanted to say in this planning process, if you're thinking about this, it's really important to share that with your family or your friends who might be your next of kin, because if it might be something that you really want and that you're really dead set on doing, but I have talked to so many families who are like, but I got to get my kids on board, or I got to get my husband or wife on board, because they're going to think this is like so disrespectful, just like seeing an open hole and just trees everywhere. So it's really important to just have that conversation early and often with people, and then, potentially come out and do a mock service with us so that they just kind of had the chance to walk through it.
Great. Yeah, so Abby asked, when do you all plan to have your next workshop? Are there any coming up on the schedule, or
So it's summertime right now, so we try not to schedule them during the summer when it's really, really hot. So we're looking towards the fall, as Angel said, and we also do them at request. So if you and a group of people wanted to put something together, you certainly reach out to us, and we would be happy to facilitate something like that.
yeah, so Abby, we definitely want to do one in the fall or winter. So if you're not already on our newsletter or follow us online, that's a good place to kind of keep up with everything that we have going on. But yeah, if there aren't any other questions, we'll say farewell to everyone. But this has been really, really great.
Yeah.
I can't wait to visit.
Yeah.
And it's such a pretty area.
Yeah, come anytime. Everyone's welcome. You can let me know ahead of time, or you can just, stop by. I have the map on our website. So thank you all so much. This is great. And I look forward to coming to more of your events. I'm definitely on board with this stuff.
Yes. All right, great. Okay, everyone have a good night.
Right. Bye.
Bye.